Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever prayed with all your heart, tears trembling, desperate words, only to be met with silence? You whispered, you shouted, you waited, still nothing moved. And in that quiet ache you may have asked, is anyone even listening? The truth is, many have been taught to pray from fear, not from position. We plead when we were meant to proclaim. We beg for scraps when we were invited to a throne. But what if the silence wasn't rejection? What if it was a call to grow? What if heaven isn't moved by emotion, but by alignment? Tonight, I want to shake that old religious dust off your prayer life and reintroduce you to kingdom prayer. Not the kind that panics, but the kind that rules. Not the kind that wonders, but the kind that knows. It's time to stop praying like a stranger and start speaking like an heir. Kingdom prayer is rooted in identity, not insecurity. It does not begin with feelings of unworthiness, desperation, or distance, but with clarity about who you are and whose you are. When you understand your true identity as a citizen of the kingdom, your posture in prayer changes. You no longer approach the king as a beggar knocking timidly at the gates, but as a rightful heir coming boldly before the throne. Identity gives you access. It's not based on how much you cry or how holy you feel in the moment, but on your relationship with the king and your position in his domain. Insecurity makes prayer unstable. It questions whether you are heard, whether you are loved, whether your words matter. It turns prayer into a guessing game, hoping something might happen, pleading as if convincing a reluctant God. But kingdom citizens don't beg. They legislate, they speak with boldness, knowing they are ambassadors sent with delegated authority. Identity eliminates the shaky foundation that insecurity builds. It replaces emotional strain with spiritual confidence. It takes you from wondering to declaring, from hoping to enforcing, from wishful thinking to purposeful speaking. The difference lies in awareness. A person who knows they are a son or daughter of the king doesn't have to qualify themselves through performance. Their access is not earned through long prayers or perfect words. It's granted through relationship and reinforced through alignment. Prayer becomes a legal exchange, not a pity party. In the kingdom, you don't plead for something already promised. You access it through understanding and enforce it through declaration. Identity-based prayer is focused and intentional. It is not scattered with insecurity or cluttered with fear. It flows from knowing the king's will and aligning with it. Insecurity often prays prayers of confusion, asking for things the king has already revealed or promised, doubting whether the answer will come, and constantly repeating requests out of fear they were missed the first time. But identity brings a calm assurance. It allows you to speak once and stand in faith, trusting that heaven has heard and is already moving. When your identity is clear, so is your authority. You don't need to feel powerful to speak with power. You simply need to know the authority behind your voice. Jesus demonstrated this when he spoke to storms, healed the sick, and cast out darkness, not with emotional noise, but with confident command. He didn't wonder if his words held weight. He knew the source of his authority. And as citizens of the same kingdom, we are called to do the same. We speak not in our own name, but in his. We pray not from panic, but from position. Kingdom prayer is effective because it's not based on manipulation. It's based on alignment. It doesn't try to persuade God to do something against his will. It declares his will into the earth with faith and precision. Insecurity prays from earth to heaven. Identity prays from heaven into earth. Insecurity asks if God is listening. Identity knows he's already responding. The shift changes everything. It transforms your words, your tone, your posture, and your outcomes. It moves prayer from a ritual to a release of authority. It empowers you to pray like a citizen, not like a stranger. Prayer is legal communication between heaven and earth. It is not merely a spiritual routine or emotional outlet, but a transaction between a government and its citizens. In the context of a kingdom, prayer functions as a lawful exchange where the citizen of earth petitions the government of heaven to intervene, respond, or enact its will on earth. This understanding elevates prayer beyond mere feelings and frames it as a responsibility, a right, and a privilege, rooted in legal access and relational alignment. You are not throwing words into the air, hoping they land. You are engaging in divine dialogue with intentionality and authority. When a citizen communicates with a king, it is not casual. It is deliberate, bound by protocol, and based on rights granted through citizenship. In the same way, prayer is not aimless chatter. It is a strategic act of invoking heaven's jurisdiction to manifest on earth. The concept of thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven is not poetic language. It is a legal request. It is a demand that what exists in the eternal government of heaven finds expression in the temporal realm of earth. For this to occur, the one praying must understand their role, not as a slave, not as a beggar, but as a legal representative. Every kingdom functions through laws, and the kingdom of heaven is no different. The laws that govern the kingdom determine what can be asked, how it can be asked, and who has the right to ask. When prayer is done in alignment with the king's constitution, his word, it gains force, just like in earthly courts. Power lies in legal precedent and alignment with the law. The same holds true in prayer. Speaking the king's word in faith activates heaven's response because heaven is obligated to uphold its own law. Prayer is not about convincing the king to act, but reminding the courts of heaven what has already been decreed. Many prayers go unanswered, not because they are insincere, but because they are illegal. They violate the principles of the kingdom. A request made outside of relationship, void of alignment with the king's will, and contrary to the purpose of heaven's government, cannot be granted. Just as a government does not respond to the cries of foreign citizens, heaven does not respond to illegal claims. That is why understanding prayer as legal communication brings clarity. It sets boundaries and expectations. It calls for maturity, knowledge, and alignment, not emotional intensity alone. Prayer also requires access. Just as legal communication in a kingdom is reserved for citizens or ambassadors, prayer is a right of those who are in right standing with the king. You must know your standing, your role, and your rights. You cannot legislate on behalf of a government you are not submitted to. That's why relationship matters. It is your citizenship that gives you access to heaven's throne. From there, your words carry weight, your petitions are heard, and your declarations are backed by the authority of the king. Prayer then becomes a spiritual legislative act, enforcing the will of heaven in the earth through legal channels of faith and obedience. Fear-based prayers often signal ignorance of authority. When someone prays from a place of desperation, panic, or terror, it often reflects a deeper misunderstanding of their position and identity in the spiritual order. Instead of approaching the Creator with confidence and clarity, they plead as if begging for favor from a distant, indifferent ruler. This posture does not reflect the confidence of someone who understands their authority. It mirrors the uncertainty of someone unaware of their legal rights as a citizen of a kingdom. Fear in prayer suggests that the individual doubts whether they are heard, whether they are worthy, or whether anything will change. That doubt is not just emotional, it is theological. When a person knows the authority they carry, fear cannot be the driving force behind their petitions. They pray from assurance, not anxiety. They make declarations, not complaints. In a kingdom, a citizen does not need to plead for what the Constitution already guarantees. Authority is not something they earn with emotional pleading. It is something they exercise through legal access. When people do not know their rights, they pray from a place of uncertainty, as if trying to persuade a reluctant judge rather than activating the will of a just king. This misunderstanding is dangerous because it weakens the the force of prayer and distorts the nature of the relationship between heaven and earth. True kingdom prayer is confident because it is informed. It understands what the king has said and aligns with it. It is not reactionary, it is strategic. Fear-based prayer reacts to crisis. Authority-based prayer responds to truth. When someone prays out of fear, they often magnify the problem more than the promise. They describe their mountain more than they speak to it. They rehearse their worries instead of releasing the word. This is a sign of a misaligned perspective, one that sees themselves as powerless instead of positioned. Authority comes from knowing who sent you, who backs you, and what has already been declared in your favor. In the kingdom mindset, prayer is not begging for intervention. It is invoking legal outcomes based on prior covenant. Fear has no place in such a process. Fear paralyzes, but knowledge empowers. That is why the foundation of effective prayer is not emotion, but revelation. You must know what has been given to you. You must understand the nature of the king and the laws of the kingdom. Only then can you pray with the certainty that your words have weight. When you know your authority, you do not panic. You proclaim. Those who lack this understanding tend to view prayer as a last resort rather than a first line of action. They turn to prayer when everything else fails rather than living in a posture of constant communication and confidence. This is because they do not see themselves as representatives of a kingdom sent to enact its agenda. Instead, they view themselves as powerless individuals hoping for mercy. This shift in identity changes everything. Once you know you carry authority, your prayers begin to reflect that confidence. They stop being driven by fear and start being shaped by faith and dominion. You stop asking for escape and start declaring outcomes. That is the posture of someone who prays with understanding, not ignorance. Jesus modeled prayer as declaration, not desperation. Throughout his life, every recorded instance of his communication with the Father reveals a tone of calm authority, strategic alignment, and unwavering confidence. He never approached prayer as a desperate plea from a powerless individual hoping to get the attention of a distant God. Instead, he spoke with assurance, grounded in his knowledge of his position, purpose, and partnership with heaven. His prayers were not riddled with fear, they were filled with clarity. Whether he was giving thanks before feeding thousands or commanding storms to be still, he demonstrated that prayer was a tool of dominion, not a cry of helplessness. One of the clearest examples of this was when he stood before the tomb of Lazarus. Rather than panicking or wailing, he lifted his eyes and simply said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me." He did not beg for a miracle, he declared life. The relationship he had with heaven was built on alignment, not anxiety. His confidence wasn't arrogance, it was authority. He knew the will of the Father and acted in accordance with it. He prayed with intent, not emotion. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, though he was deeply grieved, his prayer was still rooted in surrender, not fear. He didn't plead to escape, he sought strength to endure. Jesus never treated prayer as a transaction of desperation where he had to convince the Father to act. He didn't use emotional manipulation to twist heaven's hand. Instead, he showed that prayer is about agreement with God's will. When his disciples asked him to teach them how to pray, he gave them a model that started with honoring the king and immediately moved to a bold declaration, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." It was not a timid request. It was a confident alignment with divine intent. He showed that prayer begins with identity, proceeds with authority, and ends with expectation. His prayers were short but powerful, not because of the length, but because of the weight behind his words. He understood that the power of prayer lies not in how loud or long it is, but in how aligned it is. He didn't panic in the storm, he spoke peace. He didn't plead with demons, he commanded them. He didn't cry over the sick, he healed them. His entire life was a masterclass in how to operate in divine authority through prayer. He demonstrated that prayer is not about informing God of a crisis, it's about enforcing heaven's solution. This is a radical contrast to the kind of prayer many people practice today, which is often rooted in insecurity, confusion, and a sense of distance from God. But Jesus never prayed from a place of separation. He prayed from unity. He modeled what it looks like when someone knows their position and speaks from it. His declarations shaped reality because they echoed the will of the Father. That's the power of true kingdom prayer. It doesn't plead for permission, it declares what has already been promised. And through this example, he taught that prayer isn't about desperation, it's about dominion. The more you understand the King's will, the less you worry in prayer. Worry thrives in the absence of knowledge. When someone approaches prayer without clarity on the King's heart, purpose, or intent, their communication is filled with fear, uncertainty, and emotional unrest. But when you begin to comprehend the will of the King, what he values, what he desires, what he has already promised, you stop pleading and start partnering. Prayer becomes less about trying to convince God to act and more about coming into agreement with what has already been established in heaven. Understanding the King's will changes the tone of prayer. It replaces panic with peace. When you are unsure of what heaven wants, your words will be unstable and reactive. You will speak out of anxiety, hoping to change circumstances by emotion rather than alignment. But when you are deeply rooted in the knowledge of the King's desire, when you know His word, His character, and His priorities, your prayer becomes focused, calm, and powerful. You begin to pray with a sense of authority, not as a beggar seeking attention, but as a citizen activating promises already written in the constitution of the kingdom. The King's will is not hidden from those who seek it. It is revealed in His principles, expressed through His laws, and demonstrated through the life of those who lived in alignment with Him. The more you immerse yourself in understanding this will, the more your requests shift from self-centered desires to purpose-aligned declarations. You begin to pray not for comfort, but for clarity, not for escape, but for empowerment. You no longer approach God as a stranger, unsure of His mood, but as a son or daughter who understands the nature of the kingdom. This kind of prayer produces boldness. You stop asking for things that don't align with your assignment and start declaring outcomes that reflect heaven's intent. Fear fades because confidence grows. You no longer need to use emotional language to be heard. You know you are already heard because you are speaking in sync with the King's decree. This is where worry dies in the presence of wisdom. The more you grow in understanding, the more unnecessary noise falls away. Your prayers become sharper, more intentional, and less reactive. This is why the discipline of studying, meditating, and learning the heart of the King is vital to a strong prayer life. It equips you to speak from revelation, not desperation. You understand the seasons, the patterns of purpose behind delays or directions. Even in moments of uncertainty, your inner man stays steady because you're not relying on how you feel. You're relying on what you know about the King. This transforms prayer into an act of strategic engagement rather than spiritual guessing. You pray with direction because you understand the agenda. As your knowledge of the King's will deepens, your conversations with heaven begin to carry weight. You are no longer praying from earth, hoping to reach heaven. You are praying from a kingdom mindset, releasing heaven into earth. You begin to trust that the King's will is already aligned with your highest good and kingdom purpose. The result is a life of greater peace, greater authority, and greater clarity. Worry no longer finds a place to live in your prayer life because understanding has taken root. So as we bring this to a close, remember this. When you truly understand the will of the King, your prayers shift from restless pleading to confident declarations. you stop trying to convince heaven to act and start partnering with what heaven already intends. The anxiety, the doubt, the desperation, they begin to fade, replaced by clarity, boldness, and peace. Prayer was never meant to be a ritual of fear, but a channel of alignment, rooted in trust and identity. The more you know the King's heart, the more powerful your voice becomes. And when your voice carries the King's will, the earth listens and heaven responds.